From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Welston. Welcome now to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. Well, President Trump was back at the White House and tweeting up a storm yesterday, including a tweet that basically was calling off, apparently, the stimulus talks. Among other things, he said, I have instructed my representatives to stop negotiating until after the election, when immediately after I win, we will pass a major stimulus bill that focuses on hardworking Americans and small business. So that sounds like stimulus is off. But then he seemed to take a different tack, at least when it comes to individual payments, saying, if I'm sent a standalone bill for stimulus checks, $1,200, they will go out to our great people immediately, all caps. I am ready to sign right now. Are you listening, Nancy? Referring, obviously, to the Speaker of the House. Welcome now our chief Washington correspondent. He is Kevin Cirilli, reporting from Salt Lake City, where he will be covering the vice presidential debate tonight. So, Kevin, is the stimulus on or off, or parts of it on? What's going on?
Call it a maybe so negotiations. Confusion and befuddlement being met upon Republicans and rank and file members on Capitol Hill. Earlier this morning, I was communicating with some senior staffers in Congress who are a part of these so-called negotiations. They were completely perplexed at the president's social media postings yesterday calling off that fiscal stimulus deal. Meanwhile, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell reportedly saying that he feels that Speaker Pelosi has been disingenuous in terms of a piecemeal budget approach for calling on there to be more immediate stimulus. Now, President Trump says that they would like to get to more of a piecemeal approach, but it's unclear whether or not that will happen.
So in the meantime, one thing is clear is we're going to have a vice presidential debate out there where you are tonight. Give us a preview of it. Is it going to be all about COVID-19 as a practical matter?
That will likely be one of the 9-10-minute segments that debate moderator Susan Page will likely discuss. She has not disclosed the topics of the debates publicly or to either of the campaigns. Meanwhile, they are also, the candidates as well as the moderator, going to be standing 12 feet 3 inches apart, an extension of 3 additional feet. This has been going on as negotiations between the various campaigns along with the debate commission. Another difference from last week's debate in Ohio, David, is that all audience members will be required to wear masks. Remember, there were some in the audience last week that did not wear masks, but it just goes to show the heightened awareness around COVID-19, given the outbreak that we've seen at the White House.
We're really looking forward to seeing you tonight. Thank you so much to our chief Washington correspondent, Kevin Cirilli, who will be joining us tonight for our special coverage of the vice presidential debate. That comes up at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time. For more on the stimulus bill and whether it is truly dead, at least for now, we welcome Congressman French Hill, Republican of Arkansas. So, Congressman, thank you so much for being with us. You're a lawmaker. You're supposed to know these things. Are we going to get some form of stimulus or not?
David, great to be with you. Good to hear Kevin's reporting from Salt Lake. Here's the story from my point of view. After Nancy Pelosi dragging her feet in July and August on trying to reach a middle ground on additional COVID relief, I think the president snapped yesterday, sort of like Charlie Brown did when Lucy once again pulled the ball away to kick a field goal and he fell flat on his back. I think the president was showing his frustration yesterday. I don't think he should walk away from the table because it's his focused approach with Mitch McConnell on extending the Paycheck Protection Program, resolving the unemployment compensation issue, determine if there's support in the Senate for any additional airline support, and making sure that we have whatever public health expenses covered. These are essential to reopening our economy. So I was glad to see the president reverse course, focus on these narrow goals that the Republicans have had in Congress. And by the way, David, we have 23 Democrats who wrote the speaker last week saying her approach was wrong, her strategy was wrong, and she needed to go for a more narrow, tailored proposal.
But is that going to require essentially Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, to really cave, if I can use that expression? Because she's been pretty adamant saying, I don't want to take this piecemeal. I don't want to just pick off some of these problems. We have other problems we need to address as well.
But here's my view. Look, I think she can spin it any way she wants to. She's a master of the Beltway spin job. She's been doing it for her whole life. But my review is, look, let's fix these things that we have agreement on in the House and Senate. It's a more narrow number. It's true. She wanted to spend $3.5 trillion. Then she moved it to $2.5 trillion. The senators are somewhere under $1 trillion, and the president's around $1 trillion. Let's target that. If we need to do more, we can come back and do more after the election or after the new year. But this PPP check, Paycheck Protection Program that you've covered so diligently over the last few months, and resolving the unemployment uncertainty, and of two of these other issues, more flexibility for our governors, these help Americans right now, today, and that can be done with consensus.
We've got a pandemic, we've got the need to pull out of a recession, and we've got an election all at the same time. Tell us about your constituents out in Arkansas right now. Are they blaming Republicans? Are they blaming Democrats? Or are they basically saying, a pox on both your houses, we need help out here, and it seems like you're just dithering?
I think they're in that latter camp. I think they want both houses to come together and fix these narrow topics around which there's consensus by Democrats in the House with Republicans and in the Senate, because the economy is reopening. Our tax revenues here in Arkansas, July over to July, were up 15%. We see people going back to work. These are all good things, but there's some narrow, tailored things that we should do to keep this economic recovery moving in the right direction, and I think Jay Powell made that clear when he spoke at the NBER conference this week, talking about these important compromise issues.
No, exactly right, Congressman. He said that just yesterday. It's the danger is doing too little, not doing too much, is what he said in terms of fiscal stimulus. At the same time, we now have COVID-19 right up front and center again with the news about the president. So many people at the White House. We're seeing it pop back up. Are you concerned, or how concerned, I guess I should ask, are you that that's going to come back and hurt our economy once again?
Well, look, I think what we've learned, if we knew in February and March what we know today, we would have managed this disease, the disease fight in our economy, very differently. We would have recognized that we can treat this disease. We can prevent this disease by following the CDC standards, and we can slow the infection rate. But the bottom line is, David, this disease is probably going to end up across our country with no higher mortality than the flu. And so some of the fear issues could be brought down over time. So we have to learn to live with the virus, manage the virus as we get these therapeutics more in line, and get the hope of a vaccine early in 2021. And that's my view. So I think Americans have to recognize that fact, whether it's school, work, or travel.
Is the Congress in a position to actually act on stimulus at this point? I mean, are they physically present? Could they get it done if, in fact, we did come up with some sort of an agreement?
100%. Steny Hoyer, the majority leader in the House, said, we'll give you 24 hours notice to get you back to Washington and vote on a consensus bill that President Trump can sign into law. And that's why, in my view, the Senate can, on a narrow bill, in my view, with Nancy Pelosi's agreement, get a deal passed, and they can work over in the Judiciary Committee on the nomination. We can do more than one thing at a time in the U.S. Senate.
Okay. Thank you so much, Congressman. As I say, it's always great to have you with us. That's Republican Representative from Arkansas, French Hill. And I'm happy to say that House Speaker Nancy Pelosi will join us tomorrow right here on Balance of Power at 12 p.m. Eastern Time with her take on where those stimulus talks are. And now it's time for a check on the markets. And for that, we go to Abigail Doolittle. Abigail, where are we? We're coming back from yesterday, it looks like.
We certainly are. Never a dull day. What a 24 hours. Topsy-turvy markets, David. And yesterday, of course, President Trump, as you've been talking about, had tweeted out the idea of ending a big stimulus package. At that, the S&P 500 dropped about 2%. However, if the markets were really concerned that stimulus was completely off the table, we probably would have seen a bigger sell-off, suggesting that some folks might have thought it was a negotiating tactic. And today, here we have markets bouncing sharply higher. The S&P 500 up 1.3% on the possibility of these skinny, targeted stimulus deals. We also have bonds trading lower, really supporting the idea that we have this risk-on tone. So again, really jittery markets reacting to every headline, all of it charting out technically as a bit of noise, keeping in mind the longer-term trend, which is, the Fed has the markets back, all of that liquidity. And another story that's really pretty interesting, David, to keep in mind, helping markets recover today, because prior to President Trump's tweet in the afternoon yesterday that seemed to sink, did sink markets, at least yesterday afternoon. We had tech stocks weak on the day, and lo and behold, after the close, the House panel did put out a 400-plus page report recommending the breakup of big tech. So tech names had weighed on the market yesterday. Today we're seeing a bit of a bounce back, not quite as robust as earlier. Apple and Amazon are trading higher at this point. Alphabet and Facebook down just a bit. But that's another story to keep in mind as just one of the many pieces of the puzzle. All of this uncertainty showing with markets up, down, up, down. But right now we do have a fairly risk-on day, David.
Yeah, thank you so much, Abigail. As Abigail says, the markets are jittery. I'm not sure it's only the markets these days that are jittery, frankly. I think it's a little broader than that. Coming up, we continue our swing state look at Michigan with its Secretary of State, Jocelyn Benson. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. All this week, we're taking a closer look at the state of Michigan as part of our Swing State series leading up to the election. And today, we welcome the Secretary of State for Michigan. She is Jocelyn Benson. So thank you so much, Madam Secretary, for joining us here. We've been going through the states really understanding in part the voting process because it's a bit different this year in the middle of a pandemic, a lot more absentee ballots. So let's start there. What are you anticipating?
I'm anticipating record-breaking turnout. I'm expecting more citizens to vote in Michigan this year than ever in our state's history. And at the same time, more citizens already have voted or are voting by mail than ever before.
So to take us through that, we talked to your counterpart in Ohio, and he said they both have absentee ballots, but also have early ballots as well as voting on the day. What does Michigan provide for voters?
Basically, that same structure. I mean, citizens have three options to vote this year. They can vote from home, they can vote early in their clerk's office, or they can vote on election day. And then they have multiple ways to return their ballots if they do vote from home or pick up their ballot at their clerk's office. And importantly, we've installed 1,000 secure drop boxes across the state to give citizens the ability to vote from home and return their ballots at their convenience at their local drop box.
We've heard a lot of, frankly, litigation about the conditions surrounding absentee ballots, about whether you have to sign the outside or not, whether it's to be postmarked, whether you have to have a witness, things like that. What are the formalities in Michigan? What do you need to do to have your absentee ballot counted?
Well, importantly, you have to sign the envelope in which the ballot is placed. That signature does not have to be notarized or no witness or anything like that, but it does have to be legible and it does have to match the signature we have on file. But importantly, just yesterday, the governor signed into law legislation that will require clerks to contact voters if they receive a ballot in an envelope missing a signature or with a signature that doesn't match, to give the voter an opportunity to identify themselves and ensure that no valid ballot is not counted, and also find irregularities if they occur.
When does the ballot have to be in the possession of the election officials? Because we've seen some states where they can come in 3 days, even more later.
8 p.m. on election day is our standard. There's some litigation trying to evaluate whether ballots sent prior to election day but received after should count. But I'm advising every voter to just get their ballots in as soon as possible. If you use the mail, do it in the next few weeks. But again, we've installed over 1,000 drop boxes across the state for citizens to use. And if they've got their ballot in their local drop box by 8 p.m. on election day, it will count.
We've seen, as I say, litigation around the country. I think it's fair to say a record number of challenges at this point, well over 200. How are you doing in Michigan? What kind of challenges are you facing?
Well, it's interesting. I became an election law attorney 20 years ago, shortly after the 2000 election, and since then we've seen an exponential increase in litigation around election day. And to be now a Secretary of State with more election litigation than ever before, it's essentially at this point become, there's some credible allegations, but a lot of it has become frivolous and a way to get in the media and also kind of, create uncertainty at a time when we really need to just be communicating to voters what the rules are so that they can ensure that their ballots are counted this year.
Looking back at 2000, ultimately, obviously, the Supreme Court weighed in and invoked the Equal Protection Clause, invoked the federal constitution, and sort of took it away. Some people thought took it away from Florida. Do you think ultimately the questions, particularly involving Michigan, will be resolved at the state level, or will they end up at the federal level?
I think the voters of the state of Michigan will determine every race and outcome in the state of Michigan, bottom line. And that's my focus. That's my goal, and our clerk's goal as well. And I'm confident that will be the ultimate result.
What kind of delays are we looking at? Because when you get that record number of votes, particularly absentee ballots in, and they can come in as late as 8 p.m. that night, obviously you're not counting them all in advance.
Correct. We're not allowed to. Under Michigan law, clerks can't begin tabulating ballots that are voted absentee until 7 a.m. on election day. And when we're talking millions of ballots, over 3 million ballots, it's not possible for any infrastructure to be prepared to methodically, securely tabulate all those ballots in 12 hours. It's going to take time, but that time is the process working. It's the time ensuring accurate results. And we will be updating the public every step of the way so that citizens know exactly when they can expect the results from Michigan. They will come that week, but they may not come till Friday. And people need to know that that is simply a reflection of the process working.
So you've said that you're expecting a record turnout. We talked with your counterpart, as I said, in Ohio last week, actually, and he said he had a friendly bet with you. This is part of what he had to say. I'm sorry, we don't have it. So I'll just describe to you. He said it was a friendly bet that actually we're going to have a better turnout in Ohio than in Michigan. He made some derogatory comments about my football team, Michigan Wolverines. I'll leave those to one side. But what do you expect? Are you going to beat him in that bet?
Yeah, and you know, he can say whatever he wants, but when Michigan has higher turnout in Ohio this fall, which is what the bet's about, he will have to sing the Michigan fight song at the Michigan-Ohio State football game in the Horseshoe this December. So I'm looking forward to that, and I'm asking every Michigan voter to make sure that happens by voting this year.
Are you concerned at all about the security of those drop boxes? There have been some challenges around the country to those.
We're noting not just the actual security, but also, you know, efforts to undermine citizens' faith in the security of the process by putting out misinformation, which we've had to deal with here in Michigan. But importantly, we've got secure protocols in place to ensure our drop boxes are secure, that they're monitored and there's surveillance. And every day, people are removing the ballots from those drop boxes. Clerks are, to ensure no ballots are left overnight. So I'm confident this is going to be a secure process and that citizens can trust if they use a drop box, their local drop box, to return their ballot, it will be counted. It might be a late night for you, the night of November 3rd, I dare say. Are you bringing extra people on? What are you doing to staff up to make sure you have this all prepared? Yeah, we are. Noting back in the spring when the pandemic began to hit that we were going to face a more urgent shortage of poll workers than ever before, we began a statewide recruitment effort. We've since recruited close to 30,000 new election workers in Michigan. That's an extraordinary number and it ensures that we're ready to go and our precincts will be open, fully staffed, as well as our absentee counting boards to make sure that the process runs as smoothly and as efficiently as possible. Okay, really appreciate your time, Madam Secretary. It's really good to have you with us. Thanks to Democratic Secretary of State for Michigan, Jocelyn Benson. And a programming note now, we're going to have a special look at some of the swing states already covered in our series, this one focusing on Arizona, North Carolina, and Ohio. It will air Friday evening at 9:30 p.m. Eastern Time and throughout the weekend. And we turn now to Mark Crumpton for Bloomberg First Word News. David, thank you. Mike Pence and Kamala Harris are set to face off in a debate in Salt Lake City tonight. Ahead of the face-off, Senator Harris's campaign says she has tested negative for COVID-19. Vice President Pence's doctor said Tuesday that he has also tested negative. Both will participate in a 90-minute debate separated by 12 feet of space and a plexiglass shield. Neither they nor the moderator will wear masks. Tune in to our special coverage of the vice presidential debate tonight, both on Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg Radio. That begins at 8:30 p.m. here in New York City, and our David Weston will be hosting that. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has signaled that Democrats are willing to pass a standalone airline relief bill. She spoke today with Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin a day after President Trump ended negotiations on a big stimulus package. Last week, House Republicans blocked a Democratic proposal to provide more than $28 billion for airlines and contractors. The British government is getting ready to pull the plug on Brexit trade talks. Bloomberg has learned the UK will withdraw from negotiations with the European Union next week if there is no clear deal in sight. Prime Minister Boris Johnson has said he wants the outlines of a deal to be clear by October 15th. EU officials have said they won't be pressured into making concessions and are prepared to call the Prime Minister's bluff if he doesn't compromise. Hurricane Delta has slammed into Mexico not far from the resort city of Cancun. It weakened slightly just before making landfall. Still, winds were near 115 miles per hour, and there are fears that Delta could cause a deadly storm surge that would raise water levels by up to 12 feet. The hurricane's predicted to pick up strength as it moves over the Gulf of Mexico and takes aim at the United States. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts
in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It's time now for the stock of the hour. It's actually a check on the markets and a question really to Scarlet Fu of how are the markets pricing in this election, if they are. At this point, there's a lot of news coming out, that's for sure.
Yeah, well, just look at the last 24 hours, rollicking, and you can see it all in stock futures, right? The belief was that President Trump's diagnosis of COVID would create urgency and focus minds on the need to strike some kind of stimulus compromise. Well, his decision yesterday to halt all negotiations ended that rally, but then overnight, the flurry of presidential tweets on specific handouts to airlines and small businesses helped futures recover. So that piecemeal approach for now is halting the sell-off. We know there's a lot of money sitting on the sidelines, $4.4 trillion collecting nothing in money market accounts. And we saw investors begin to put some of that money to work after the initial plunge in March. Within equities, that money first went to defensives like big tech, and now increasingly it's rotating to value stocks. As for how analysts are gaming out the election, few scenarios favor the U.S. dollar, which is already under pressure. Kit Jukes over at SocGen told Bloomberg Television this week that the U.S. seems to be refocusing away from tech and equities to measures that are more household friendly. So that'll lead, he says, to more deficit spending. That'll be negative for the U.S. dollar. Meantime, you look at rates, they have broken out of their recent tight range, the 10-year yield rising to as high as 79 basis points yesterday on the back of reflation hopes. CIBC World Markets says it's unlikely to reach 1%, though with markets pretty convinced that the Federal Reserve would likely step in to keep rates low. And if you look at the odds for a Biden victory, they're now at a peak of 66%, according to the betting market predicted. Nomura Wolf has a long-short strategy betting on a Biden win that is also at its high. And the thinking, as you've discussed, is that a Democratic sweep would mean more fiscal spending, offsetting, if not compensating, for higher corporate taxes. So that is neutral to short-term positive for risky assets, including stocks.
Thank you, Scarlett. Just one quick thought on Eli Lilly. They're pressing ahead for some approval for an emergency use of a therapy, not a vaccine for COVID-19.
That's right. It'd be FDA approval for emergency authorization. And this is key to remember that it's not a treatment, it's not a vaccine, it's a bridge to a vaccine, these antibodies, because they could help people who are exposed to or exhibit early symptoms, prevent them from blowing up into severe cases. Remember, President Trump was given an experimental antibody treatment from Regeneron last week. And Bloomberg Intelligence says that at $2,000 per dose, 1 million doses in the fourth quarter for Eli Lilly would make a substantial financial impact.
Indeed.
David?
Thank you so much, Scarlett Fu, for that report. Coming up tomorrow on television and radio, we're going to be joined by Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi. We will, of course, talk about the battle over stimulus and much more. This is Bloomberg Balance of Power. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David West. We have breaking news right now crossing the Bloomberg. The U.S. reportedly is exploring, at least, restricting Ant Group Tencent payment systems. And so we want to go to Nick Wadhams, our person who really covers national security for us in Washington. As we know, Tencent Ant is a huge operation in China. Not clear how much it is used really in the United States, but this is apparently, perhaps, if it pans out to be the case, an extension of the Trump administration's general efforts to try to make sure that the Chinese technology is not jeopardizing national security. And now we will go to Nick Wadhams, our colleague who covers national security for us in Washington. So explain this to us as best you can, Nick. I just saw the headline cross.
So what we know is the administration is looking at ways to restrict Alipay and TenPay, so Ant Group's financial payment system, the digital payment system, as well as Tencent Holdings' digital payment system. And this is really born of a belief that they're afraid these apps, these platforms could be used to soak up user data, banking details, and things like that. So even though Alipay, for example, is not widely used in the United States, there's a fear that as these digital payment systems spread, that China's Communist Party could gain more access to that data. So they want to fire a shot across the bow now. There's also the issue of Ant is going to have a mega IPO in Hong Kong and Shanghai in a couple weeks. and they really want to send a message that they're going to likely deter or seek to deter investors from that because they say sanctions or some other form of punishment is coming.
So, Nick, I want to be careful here, and you really correct me if I go too far. A report right now is that the U.S. is exploring this. Not that they're doing it, but they are exploring at least the possibility. It sounds a little bit like a chapter 2 in the TikTok book. Is that right?
That's a great way of putting it. Yes, this is exploratory right now, so it's not something that's going to happen imminently. There is not an order that has been drafted that is ready to go out the door. And indeed, that's one of the problems because there's a lot of concern. Look, they went after TikTok, they went after WeChat, and look what happened. Courts basically said, listen, this is invalid. You are guilty of executive overreach here, and we're going to impose an injunction on those orders. So the administration, there's a lot of talk. Okay, we want to go after these payment systems. We believe they are a threat, but how do we do it in a way that essentially doesn't blow up in our face and embarrass us the way that the WeChat and TikTok orders did? And that's where the discussions are focusing right now.
Okay, Nick, thank you so much for reporting. That's Nick Wadhams reporting. He's our national security expert, and we'll continue to report on that story as it develops. In the meantime, I want to turn to colleges and universities here in the United States. Really across the country, they've been trying to adapt to the world of COVID with a blend of remote learning and social distancing and testing. Welcome now the head of one of the leading public universities in the country. As an alma mater, I would say it is the leading institution. He is Dr. Mark Schlissel of the University of Michigan. So, Dr. Schlissel, thank you so much for being here. Give us a sense. It's helpful that you are, in fact, a medical doctor in addition to leading the University of Michigan. How has this affected the University of Michigan and its operations?
Well, it's been very challenging. We've been trying to conduct what we're calling a public health informed semester. About 80% of our student interaction is online, about 20% in person. And the things we're doing in person are things that you could really only do well in person. Teaching labs, music and arts instruction, for example, and the larger lectures have all been placed online. Nonetheless, the vast majority of our students are here in Ann Arbor, both living on campus and off campus. And it's a real challenge keeping them safe and healthy in the setting of this novel infectious disease.
Do you have any sense of the percentage, if you can calculate it that way, of the instruction going on that's in person versus remote at this point?
Yeah, we're about 80% remote, about 20% in person, according to what we call student credit hours. So that's the numbers of students and the class hours.
And what is the testing regimen, as it were, and what does it tell you about the positive incidents and the active cases?
Well, our frequency of positive tests is a couple of percent when we're screening randomly, doing surveillance screening. We've had altogether 200 or 300 cases among students, but in the recent weeks, the rate of those cases has gone up. It's mostly in the setting of off-campus social situations where the disease is spreading. We've had very little, if any, spread in the classroom or on the campus. It's mainly in residence halls and fraternities and sororities and in social circumstances off campus.
We've heard about some of the fraternities and sorority parties and other off-campus parties in other campuses around the country. What can you do about that? Can you police that effectively? Do you actually suspend students if they're found to have attended one of these?
Well, the approach is education, and we're collaborating with the state and our local government here, who've placed a limit on the number of people that can be present indoors at an event. So a 10-person limit, a 25-person limit for outdoor congregation of people at a party or an event. So we, try to enforce this by educating the students why it's important. And frequently that ends up with us talking to students with a threat of going into a student disciplinary proceeding, but we've had to do very little of that. The vast majority of our students want to be here. They're wearing masks on campus, outdoors and indoors. They're doing all the things we ask them to do. The challenge is doing that 24/7. So I think particularly on the weekends, particularly late in the evenings, people's guard is let down and behavior diminishes, compliance diminishes.
Dr. Schlissel, as you say, the primary mission of the University of Michigan is education, after all, but you're also a very big employer and you have a very big business, if I can put it that way, to run there. How has it affected your revenue? How has it affected your ability to employ those thousands and thousands of people you do?
Sure. In the very early days of the pandemic, most people don't appreciate it, completely disrupted healthcare. So we have a big academic medical center called Michigan Medicine with a 1,000-bed hospital, 2.5 million clinic visits a year. It's responsible for about 55% of our total budget. So it's over $5 billion health system. And in the short term, when the pandemic first hit in Michigan, we were losing hundreds of millions of dollars over the course of several months because we basically stopped doing routine care and focused on treating the pandemic. That's gotten much closer to normal. The academic side of the university, we sent all our students home back in March and then put education online. And as I said, now we're a mixture. We're losing 40 or $50 million based on increased expenses and decreased revenues in our educational enterprise because of the pandemic. But you have to put that in the context. We're a $10 billion organization, so the losses are significant, but we're managing.
Listen, as I say, I'm an alum, so I would be remiss if I didn't ask about Big Ten football.
Yeah.
You're bringing it back, as I understand it, later on in the month. What kind of steps are you going to try to take to make sure that those players are safe? Because actually, we had 3 more cases in the NFL just today.
Yep. So we put a hold on all intercollegiate athletics back in early August when the doctors advising us about how to conduct sports safely figured out that we couldn't use social distancing and masks and hand washing on a football field. The nature of the game is a contact game with body fluids all over the place. So we put a pause and we set our folks to work saying, what can we do to make competitions and practice safe? And a few weeks ago, the docs came back and said, look, we have a capacity now to test people every day with a short turnaround test. It's not as sensitive as the PCR test. It's an antigen-based test. But if you do it every single day on everybody that's entering our facilities and everyone that's going on the playing field, there's a 99.9% chance that there's nobody with disease who's in a competition. So once we had a paradigm of everyday testing with a quick turnaround test, we were comfortable heading us back on a pathway to play. There won't be spectators in the stands. So that big house that you remember with 110,000 people, we're just going to have family members and then the staff of the football team and then the referees and the like, plus our student athletes. And that's it. It'll be broadcast on TV. But once we figured out how to do it safely, we decided to go ahead and do it.
So, Dr. Schlissel, take a step back for a moment. As I say, colleges and universities right across the country are dealing with some form of this challenge right now. As you look out, what are the possible long-term changes in higher education, whether it's the way we educate people or, for that matter, the business model itself? Are we going to lose some of our colleges?
Well, I think that we will. I think people are going to look hard at the value proposition because right now, a lot of education is remote. We've been working for years, not just since the pandemic, on trying to figure out what's the right way to integrate online modalities of education with the things you could only do in person. So many people will learn just fine instead of sitting in a 300-person lecture, taking the online component of that course. But then we use the in-person time for problem solving, group activities, more entrepreneurial learning. And then we're still big believers in the value of residential higher ed, where we bring students together from all different parts of the country, all different parts of the world. And a lot of the education occurs informally outside the classroom from a diverse student body. So education will adjust. The pandemic has hastened that adjustment by forcing us to experiment and innovate around online modalities and then find ways to blend them into more in-person activity.
Are we going to ever get back to a day where we actually all go back to college, or are we always going to have some sort of a blended result as a practical matter?
I think the blended thing is actually a huge value added. Imagine if you want to do study abroad, which many students do, but you need a certain course to continue on your pathway to graduation. Well, if you can take that course remotely in a high quality form and do your study abroad in Paris or do your study abroad in Beijing, that's a huge advantage for education. Or if you want to do a summer internship, but take some classwork while you're doing the internship. So it liberates students from place, but it doesn't replace some of the in-person learning that occurs between people. We haven't found great ways to replace that by online modalities.
Dr. Schlissel, finally, we have an election coming up, as you may have noticed. And historically, a place like the University of Michigan was a real center for registration, for activism on one side or the other, Republican or Democrat. How is that being affected this year? Is it going to affect the degree of participation by college students?
Well, the activism is different. It's gone online. So we still have students with rallies and protests on campus, sometimes right outside my home here on campus. But they're behaving. They're wearing masks and they're distancing. So everybody is doing their activism in a responsible way. Much more online petitions, Zoom meetings and discussions. But we've been engaged since the 2016 election, trying to get more and more of our students to take personal responsibility for registering and voting. It was quite embarrassing to me that our turnout of Michigan students for the 2016 presidential election was below 20%. So more students were complaining about the outcome than were actually voting. So we really pushed very hard on this. We've tried to make it easy. Michigan itself as a state has a no questions asked absentee ballot policy. Early voting has already begun in the state. We've opened up on campus a place where the county clerk sits on campus and can do registration and take absentee ballots to remove concerns about the U.S. mail. So our students are going to vote this time in very high numbers, and we want them all to exercise that franchise. It's critically important.
Doctor, thank you so very much for your time today. Really appreciate this. Dr. Mark Schlissel, he is president of the University of Michigan. And breaking news just a few minutes ago, we now have learned that Vice President Mike Pence and Senator Kamala Harris have both tested negative for COVID-19. That's in anticipation of tonight's debate. Coming up, breaking up the big tech firms. The House Antitrust Subcommittee has laid out a plan. We talked with the former head of Hewlett-Packard, Carly Fiorina, about whether the proposals make any sense. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. The Antitrust Subcommittee of the House Judiciary Committee yesterday released its report, the climax of its extensive inquiry into application of the antitrust laws to big tech. To give us at least the outlines of the 449 count-on-page report, we welcome now Ben Brody of Bloomberg News, who covers tech regulation in Washington. So, Ben, give us the top line here of what they propose. It's fairly radical as I read it.
That's correct. The basic idea would be to kind of set off online marketplace platforms from the smaller competitors that actually operate on those platforms. So Amazon operates basically a place where third-party merchants can sell, but of course it's also competing against those merchants because it's a retailer itself. So the idea would be to kind of structurally separate those, and it could basically prompt breakups in a wide swath of tech if it were to actually come to pass.
Yeah, I've heard it described as sort of a Glass-Steagall for tech, as it were. At the same time, it also has a new rule. If you're defined as a dominant company, and they have a definition of that, it's assumed that if you acquire or merge with anything, it's anti-competitive.
That's right. It would sort of be a reversal of the way that merger enforcement is done right now, with government has to prove that it's anti-competitive. And the idea is basically to make sure that more mergers, particularly of small companies, ones that are just starting to take off in the digital space, don't go through. That's openly what they are talking about, and it would certainly be a big reversal if it did go through.
And Ben, as a practical matter, is this going anywhere?
That's a great question. The Republicans have not signed on to this report, and they have referred to several of these ideas, the two we just discussed included, as basically non-starters. But of course, the landscape politically next year could look very different. Republicans still have some power in the Senate to slow things down if they don't like it, even if they lose power, which is not definite in any way, shape, or form. But I think this conversation begins because the anger at tech's power is only growing here in D.C.
Okay, Ben, thank you so much for that report. That's our very own Ben Brody. Carly Fiorina ran her own big tech company, Hewlett-Packard, and then went on to run for president. She is the founder and chairman of Carly Fiorina Enterprises and Unlocking Potential, and we welcome her now back to Bloomberg. So, Carly, always a delight to have you here. As I say, you ran a big tech company. As you look at this, do these suggestions make sense to you?
Well, first, David, it's a pleasure to be back with you. And before we get into the specifics, let me just say to you and the audience what I said to several of my Silicon Valley colleagues last week. I think technology, big tech, the Valley, needs to come to grips with the fact that this is a new era now. Technology for the longest time was secure in the knowledge that there was bipartisan support in Washington, D.C. for leaving them alone. They were in a special category. They grew the economy. No one was going to touch them. That era is over. And while there may be disagreement between Republicans and Democrats about the specifics, what there is bipartisan agreement around is the fact that big tech has too much power. There is bipartisan support for that, and Republicans said that in response to this report. There is also bipartisan, may I say, lack of trust in much of the leadership of big tech. And so whether these specific provisions go anywhere or not, I think technology firms need to deal with the reality that they are now in the crosshairs of Washington, D.C., and they need to think strategically about how to be part of the solution. Otherwise, they might not like where this ends up.
Carly, what do you make of the overall, as I take it, conclusion of this report, which is basically the very size of these very big tech companies, really the big four we're talking about now, have actually made it less likely there will be innovation, that there will be new upstart competitors to come along. From your experience, does that ring true? Because what the big tech companies say is, oh no, we're investing all the money in the world into innovation. We're responsible for the innovation.
Well, the truth is, David, I think both statements are true. I think if you look at where innovation traditionally has come from, it has come from the smaller startups. After all, that's what Google once was. That's what Amazon once was. That's what Apple once was. That's what all these companies, Facebook, once were. And it's also true that these huge technology companies now have a great interest in leveraging others' innovation, but they do so by buying them up. That's what they have done. And finally, I would say it is undoubtedly true that these companies have a market power and a power over consumers, not to mention consumer information, that's really almost unprecedented. And so I think technology companies can no longer make a credible argument that somehow they are in a different category, that if you do anything to internet-based companies in terms of regulation or oversight, that somehow you are going to curtail their growth. I just don't think that argument rings true anymore. And that's why I think strategically they need to think about how to be a part of this conversation instead of just saying, no, there's nothing to see here, there's nothing to do here. That's not going to fly.
Carly, you mentioned earlier the leadership of some of these companies. Let's talk about leadership right now. How do you lead a company that arguably is winning by too much? You had a phenomenon with IBM, you could say that happened with. You could say it happened with Microsoft. What can a leader do in that situation?
Well, first, I think I don't want to be too critical here, but I do think that some of the leaders of some of these companies have damaged their case a bit by being, we now know, less than forthcoming about what was really going on. And so we've seen, I think, too many instances where leaders have come before Capitol Hill, and let's face it, that's not a pleasant experience for any CEO, and CEOs get very outraged about the hypocrisy, all of which is deserved. Nevertheless, when a CEO is found to be less than forthcoming, that's not helpful to their cause. So I think the most important thing for these tech CEOs to do is to decide strategically that the best course is not resistance at all costs, but instead to try and be part of the solution here. You know, I started my career out in telecommunications, and there was a long period of time where AT&T, as the big power, resisted at all costs being part of the solution. That resistance cost them in the end. And so I think these CEOs need to think through, what are they willing to live with? How can they influence the legislative process here on both sides of the aisle to come up with something that's going to work? But just leave us alone isn't politically feasible anymore. And I think the economic arguments for just leave it alone, honestly, are no longer completely credible.
Just briefly here, the conclusion, Carly, is it a plausible defense to say we've got to worry about China?
Well, yes and no. I mean, yes, of course, we do need to worry about China. And that is why our approach to China must be consistent and persistent and strategic, and that requires collaboration between government and business, which hasn't always been in evidence over the last 20 years. It also means that we need to be consistent across administrations when we deal with China and between parties, which we haven't always been. However, these tech companies are winning globally, It's why the European Union has taken some of them on. And so that argument is important, but I don't think it will be successful in saying, just leave us alone.
Just a terrific perspective, as always, from Carly Fiorina. She is chairman of Carly Fiorina Enterprises and Unlocking Potential. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We have some news out of the White House now about the president's health. According to the president's doctor, his vital signs remain stable in the normal range. He has been fever-free for 4 days now, and President Trump has been symptom-free for over 24 hours. That is according to a memorandum released by President Trump's doctor. And that's all as we get ready for that vice presidential debate coming up tonight. Tune in for our live coverage and analysis of that vice presidential debate. It will start at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg.